Blizzard, legendary game developer, the company that brought us Diablo, Warcraft Overwatch, Hearthstone, and much, much more. Today, let's take a look at their humble beginnings on the Super Nintendo on SideQuest. 1991, the year that brought us Nirvana's Nevermind, Seinfeld, and most importantly, the Super Nintendo, a company called Silicon and Synapse quietly released their first game for the Super Nintendo. The game was Radical Psycho Machine Racing, or R.P.M. Racing. Silicon and Synapse would later change their name to Blizzard and would soon rule the world. R.P.M. Racing, a slight remake of a game called Racing Destruction set on the Commodore 64, is a three-quarters view racer with hills and valleys, sharp turns, and even a small amount of weapons. It even included a create-your-own track editor. It was an early Super Nintendo title released mere months after its launch, but sadly gameplay and graphically, this game was on the bland side. Unfortunately, it doesn't have much style or character like similar racers of this sort like R.P.M. from the NES. Luckily, Blizzard revisits this style of game later on the Super Nintendo and hits the mark dead on, in a game we'll talk about shortly. Following the release of R.P.M. Racing, the next title Blizzard released on the Super Nintendo, still under the name Silicon and Synapse, was the excellent puzzle platformer called Last Vikings. The game combines comedy, puzzles, and challenging gameplay that is done really well. In Last Vikings, you control and switch between three Vikings, all with their own abilities to solve puzzles. You play as Eric the Swift, who can run, jump, and break some walls, Balog the Fierce, who can attack enemies with a sword or arrows, and Olaf the Stout, who can block enemies with fire with a shield or use it to glide through the air. The story goes, after a long day of hunting, the Vikings crash out hard and while sleeping are abducted by aliens, who carry them off to their ship. The alien leader Tomator plans to add them to his intergalactic zoo. Let's hope it's not a petting zoo, because that's gross. The Vikings do find their way off the ship, but find themselves lost in various time periods until eventually they defeat Tomator and find their way home. It's a great game. However, there is one noted flaw. In order to pass a level, you need all three Vikings. However, if one of your Vikings die, the game keeps going. You basically have to kill off the other Vikings and restart. The game should have just ended when one of your Vikings died. Blizzard's third game, called Rock and Roll Racing, takes all the wrongs made by R.P.M. Racing and fixes everything wrong with its predecessor. Still under the company name Silicon and Synapse, Rock and Roll Racing was originally set to be R.P.M. Racing Part 2. The boredom and unenthusiasm I felt playing R.P.M. Racing's tracks and cars are now replaced with thought-out tracks, wacky characters, and tons of style. And as if R.P.M. Racing wasn't bad enough, although you want to respect it, Rock and Roll Racing makes it so you would never, ever, ever, ever want to play R.P.M. Racing again. Rock and Roll Racing is really fun. It's once again an isometric racer, but it adds character selection, a witty race commentator, and popular classic rock tunes turned chip tunes like Paranoid, Bad to the Bone, and Born to be Wild. But I can't play them here because I only own the rights to the Beatles catalog and it ain't on here. And because of that soundtrack is why it's called Rock and Roll Racing. Out of all these games, this next one has to be my favorite. It's Blackthorn. The first game released using the Blizzard name. They also still use the same Blizzard logo as today, just a little more pixely. Blackthorn is great. It's like everything in this game was calculated to be badass. Take for example the way Kyle Blackthorn can draw his gun and shoot behind him without even looking, or the way captives are hanging from chains and drop when shot, and the way you can hide in the shadows to avoid enemy fire. Blackthorn is a cinematic platformer similar to Out of This World or Prince of Persia. It has fluid, lifelike movement, calculated action, and challenging gameplay. The story of Blackthorn is huge and is explained in a hefty game manual. However, the short story is the hero, Kyle Blackthorn Valros, is told that it's time to return from Earth to his planet Tool and reclaim his throne and save his people from the enemy, Sarlacc. It's a dark platformer with 17 levels with 4 areas. Kyle can upgrade and become more powerful through the game, and it's a ton of fun. The next game Blizzard put out on the Super Nintendo was The Death and Return of Superman. It was released in 1994 and followed the successful Superman storyline from '92, where Doomsday and Superman kill each other in an epic battle. The game is a large sprite side-scrolling beat-em-up similar to Final Fight. In The Death and Return of Superman, you play through 5 different versions of Superman: the original, Cyborg Superman, the Eradicator, Superboy, and Steel. Each of these have their own super moves. There's 10 levels where you can shoot, punch, and kick your way through until the final boss battle where Superman squares off against the Cyborg. There are even a couple of shmup-style shooting levels that help break up monotony. I highly recommend checking this one out. It's good fun and a pretty tough game. The next game that Blizzard worked on was another DC Comics IP. It's Justice League Task Force, a fighting game that utilizes DC heroes and villains in a fighting game similar to Street Fighter. It even uses a move list for each character similar to the moves in Street Fighter. Graphically, this game is nice and the heroes look fantastic. However, the game is just kind of bland with not much extra added in. The game actually received poor reviews, but it's still worth checking out if you are a Blizzard fan or a fighting game fan. And finally, the last game Blizzard released on the Super Nintendo was the Last Vikings 2. This one is more puzzle adventure fun, just like the first. The 3 Vikings return and are once again captured by Tomater, but this time they have new robotic abilities and a joyful adventure, but this time they are also accompanied by new friends, a werewolf named Fang and a dragon named Scorch, who help them on their quest. It's tons of fun and one of the best games that Blizzard released on the Super Nintendo, sending them out on a high note. So that quickly covers all 7 games Blizzard released on the Super Nintendo. What do you think about these games? Have you ever played any of them? What current Blizzard games are you into? Let me know in the comments and be sure to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time on SideQuest.